Hey, everyone, Polish Psychiatry Party. We're going to have to run in 2022. I tell you what, it seems that the Liberals are not going to do what they should, which is to abolish all forms of civil conscription in the legislature that is in the state territory legislature that allows forced medico-pharmaceutical, they call them provisions. And in the Australian Constitution, this is 1/5/51 23A was an amendment made in 1946. And in 1946, people were horrified at what had happened in Nazi Germany. They did not want the Holocaust to continue in Australia. Australians had protested for psychiatry and all forms of forced medical personnel being forced on them, provisions being coerced and more or less forced on people, things put in food that were said to be healthy, when something was said to be an equivalent to another actual food and it wasn't a real food, and it caused people to be slowed down, not be able to work, all of that. But civil conscription, when you're talking about that, we're talking about forced psychiatry, which is, it's civil conscription that does not allow for a person to conscientiously object. In Australia, this is what happens. And to have that there, to have a system of force where a person is arbitrarily detained in a facility and used for stealth weapon tests. That's what you've got to call them, these chemical and physics tests that psychiatrists and other medicos do on people by force. Now, in an age system, same thing happening, and horrifying, because also there's the dispossession of them, then taking property from that person as well by force, and saying it's for the person's own good. It is not for the person's own good. It is for the profit and power of those the criminal intention of those medicos. Now, the federal minister has come out with a budget that just, there's no way I would vote a Liberal government in on this. No way. I was looking at thinking that Liberal government would be more likely to reinforce Australia's Constitution 23A and say that the states and territories must comply with the Constitution in order to make Australia's security more secure. Because you cannot have a great big gaping hole on the contract that is Australia's Constitution, and to have that violated. You just can't have that happening. Flagrant violation, ripper acts in each state and territory that force these so-called provisions that are also in 23A, but the proviso is, or the clause is, that these will not be forced. They will not be civil conscription. So the people will not be subjected to forced human experimentation, particularly of the diabolical kind that Australians have been subjected to for so long. That should have happened in 1946, but in 1948, the British Medical Association came in with a big challenge to Australia and wanted to test that and so forth and so on, and bring Pfizer in, because Pfizer, while it's a USA company, yeah, UK had vested interests in that in the time, and they also had an interest in various acoustics line of that, so their physics line of the Pfizer, as well as the chemical stuff that Pfizer does as well. So they wanted to use Australian people forcefully for these tests, and they were a little concerned about that, what that in brackets in our constitution might mean, that people could refuse that, and that should have happened all along, except states and territories were given the power, despite the constitution, to make forced medical orders, and they should never have been allowed to do this because it's unconstitutional. Now, if I were able to see any means in a comedic tell on the speech Frydenberg has given on budget, I would be going there. However, I'm taking these things very seriously because it's horrible at the moment what is happening in Australia as far as the attacks on Australian businesses, our lives and livelihoods by the medicos, the doctors and nurses that are in the front line, on the front line. I mean, is that an advertise for some worm drug? Probably. Dr. Worm, I'm sure you have the song line happening there somewhere. That just think on this a little bit more here and realise these doctors and nurses cannot form a militia in our country. We do not want a white coat militia. We do not want a pharmaceutical militia there in our country doing this. It's just out and out wrong. I cannot endorse that, what he's saying there. And as for having teachers and students in a virtual classroom, what do you want with a virtual teacher? What does that say about teaching? Half there? Not even there. Not a real teacher in a virtual classroom or on monitors. What are we doing to people? That's just not life. So I would, if they're going to go that way, then you should allow students to just say that's not what they want to attend, or maybe whatever they want to do, give them choice to do that. But that sounds, if that's going to be the main thing, then that's just horrible. It sounds really horrible. And civil conscription. And this use of what are we talking about when we're talking about what is happening when medicos are pseudo-medicalising what are stealth weapons. So we're talking about the chemistry and physics experiments that pharmaceutical companies are doing. So we want a reality happening here, and we certainly do not want vaccinationists being given vacations, little island vacations on our tax dollar. That's really what's happening here, is that pharmaceutical companies are getting a whole lot of money. Why? What did they do to get that? We don't want them. They're the horror. They're the militia that's forming. They're the enemy to the people. There are so many things that Australian people can do, and they're being crushed by the pharmaceutical medico militia in our country that has got to be stopped. That's really it. You don't budget for them. You don't give them money. Or what are you doing? Aiding and abetting the enemy, really. And that's what people will say later in history if this all goes ahead. Now, I am really just horrified that there's nothing in this that is going to be what Australians want and need, and give people real businesses, real Australian businesses, not these pharmaceutical companies coming into Australia to forcefully experiment on Australian people, but real businesses that are here, that are don't want to be crushed by the big companies that are actually not doing what they're saying they're doing. They're actually criminal intent, because their advertise is false and misleading, and that they use induction technology as well makes them criminal in that as well, and that they have links to pharmaceutical companies in an entanglement that is quite a cobble, and though it may be profitable in the short term for some people in Australia that are just wrong, because they're not realising what's going to happen if they do that. I could go on. Could talk about how, horrified I am by your this. I was almost speaking to the Liberal Party there, but I'm not. They wouldn't listen to me. It's probably very obvious. They're not. They're not listening to the Australian people. To budget for testing and tracing and stuff like that. It's just proven to be horrifying. It is proven to be criminal. If they don't know that by now. If they do know that, then they're repeating what Menzies did. Had a little conversation, a little conference of, I can make this all good for you. And then just keep quiet about 23A again and do the civil conscription all again. Is that, and call it industrial conscription, or call it social conscription, or whatever other word gets substituted there. When people are induced to do things that are going to be really damaging in the long term. It's so damaging in the short term that to not see the trajectory that is happening to Australia at the moment is really flawed, and to budget for the pharmaceutical company to give them money. It's just horrifying that the federal government's going to be complicit in forced human experimentation, or coercive control human experimentation, which is civil conscription. I would recognise the civil conscription that is forced psychiatry and forced age system is slavery for the purposes of torturously cruel forced human experimentation, and that cannot be argued with. What is really disturbing is that there is a budget for biotech. Now, this is an area that in Australia it has not it's been done without consent. It has been civil conscription. So to budget for that, and it is this massive human rights violation. And there's a lot I could say about it right now, but just put it this way, nobody wants their privacy invaded. Nobody wants coercive control on their on who they are, and nobody wants to have their to be tagged by various machines, including those that are criminal pharmaceutical companies. So to have your biodata tagged by criminals who want to get away with their crimes just makes Australia's whole legal system upside down reverse. What do you want to call it? Doesn't work. That psychiatrists have reversed legal terms over years that in the context of eugenics has been a worldwide horrifying encroachment on law. While I can't speak for every country, there's a lot of countries that have that there happening, and Australia is must stop that, and we have the means to do that, and we have to because it's in our constitution. We did the amendment in 1946 to say no civil conscription. So if Australia doesn't do that and they continue to budget, because in 23A they have these provisions, all these provisions that are in Frydenberg's budget, provide for this, provide for that, that are forced on people. And when you're talking medico, pharmaceutical, dental, that sort of thing, they're not allowed to be civil conscription. So if any of these are forced or can be done in a way that would be considered civil conscription, Frydenberg's budget is in direct violation of Australia's constitutional stand, and that is a contract. And the Liberal government that's in at the moment, the federal Liberal government, most especially, must comply with Australia's constitution when they draw up plans for budgets and so forth. And to have this whole disaster happen because of the security systems being thrown into difficulty because of the government hasn't brought the states and territories into line and said, look, you cannot have these acts that allow that force medicine and pharmaceutical products. You just can't have them. They're in flagrant violation of the Constitution. They are civil conscription. They are slavery and torture. You cannot have them in your legislature. Federal government haven't done that yet. And federal government is, by doing this budget, endorsing this, the Holocaust which wanted to be prevented in 1946, when everyone was given that in the world was given that writ to make certain that that forced human experimentation did not continue, that eugenics horror into the extreme, and Australia's trajectory on that just gets worse and worse. So it's really very, very scary. It actually has to go. We can't. it has to go in the states and territories. Those legislature has to be removed. We have that constitutional right to refuse. It is there in the Constitution. And that makes Australia worse, because they agree to something and then they don't do it, and then they try to twist the words and say, no, that's about something. It is absolutely only about the people refusing those provisions and the providers. So none of those providers can force themselves on the public and say, you must take my provisions. That's what it says in 23A. Can't interpret it any other way. So if none of the federal government ministers are going to come out and say that, then it has to come from somewhere. And that's when the Labor movement steps in. So that'll come then from various unions. So unions get together and say, we're not going to have any more of these pharmaceutical, medical companies pushing us around. We're going to have our workforce being strong. We're not going to have these companies, because they've been crushing us. We've got all the resources here. We've got all the means, and we're being violated in most horrible ways. And we want to stop them, because it's not something that should be happening. It's a horrible thing. These physics and chemistry. Forced human experimentation on people. It's just disgusting. And an encroachment on Australia's business for profit and power for that. And as well, there's a trajectory of, it's horrifying. And to have that happen again, we've got to stop it. So if the Liberal government don't do it, and they're looking like they're not going to do it, it has to come from the Labor then. So we'll look at the Labor and the unions, and that if the unions start working well to push the interference away, which is a criminal-based interference. It's usually also a foreign entity, but they're a crime-based foreign entity. It's usually not a country-to-country matter. And that's where I think it's a very strange thing that they're pointing at countries again, the same ones that they pointed at back in, was it around about 1949, 1946. It's around about then they were pointing at the same countries they're sort of pointing at now, saying you're encroaching. It's not really about that. It is about the criminal companies that are being given funding from our government and allowed to experiment on Australian people by force, which is in violation of our Constitution, and the ministers in charge who are violating their contract to the people. And when the government violates the contract to the Australian people, or to any people of any country, they're going to open up the security to all sorts of holes. And that's what's happened over a long period of time. It's at a time to crack down on that. And they haven't yet. And just outrageous that they haven't. So it will likely, unless they do that in the next 2 weeks or so, it's going to come from the Labor movement. And I predict that unless I doubt it will become from Albanese. I don't think he'll stay in power. He backs the pharmaceutical, medico invaders and criminals way too much. He has backed them all along way too much, and has done things that I really consider outrageously disgusting. So I doubt whether he will stay in power together. It has to come If it has to come from a Labor government, then that's it. And it doesn't come from the government, it comes from the unions pushing the Labor government to do as they're told, as far as stopping the medico-pharmaceutical invasion of our country and people that has been so horrifying for so long and has been so it is moving on a trajectory towards dispossession again. So the dispossession of 200 years ago of the people here, that all happening again, just horrifying. If they allow those pharmaceutical medico companies to do that, that's exactly where they're going. So Frydenberg really is not, it's not going to happen with this. I mean, outrageous. Like the vaccine, what do they call it? The vaccinationist concoction for on women's cervix. It caused paralysation. Australia led that paralysation of women. Bionic ears. That's horrifying. Deaf community hates that. Wi-Fi. The medicos interfere with that all the time in Australia. You know, when people might say that I'm saying too much, it's not about a person like me saying too much. It's about a pharmaceutical violator, a pharmaceutical company that's done violations, criminal violations of Medico. Like it's someone like a psychiatrist that has enslaved and tortured and murdered people. It's about them saying too much. They're criminals. They should not be allowed to publish books. They should not be allowed to speak and profit from their crimes. So don't ever tell me that I'm saying too much about anything, because that's not about that line about saying too much and keeping quiet. That's about the criminals, which are in Australia are the medico-pharmaceutical industries and their cohorts, their laboratories and so forth. Threatening, horrible violators. There is a lot more I could say. That I hadn't prepared this to really give you anything more than just a upfront and quick. It was meant to be quick look at what was going on here. Insurance companies, they never do their job. They always step in front of the human rights that are meant to happen, which here it's don't do civil conscription, 23A, stop it. So things can be secure. But those other countries that own those pharmaceutical companies, they don't want Australia to be secure. They want Australia to be a country where they can test their products. And I'm not saying that's the problem of that particular country over there. I'm just saying that's their pharmaceutical company. And while that pharmaceutical company might do jobs for the UK or might do jobs for the US that are nice and friendly, they don't do any friendly things in Australia. None. And as for that whole word disabilities, Australia's constitution defines it. And Australia has just taken that word and tried to place it upon people that should never be said to have disabilities. These people being subjected to civil conscription, and that's where it comes in. So the people subjected to civil conscription for no other reason than benicos and pharmaceutical companies want to make money and gain power from that by doing a crime that should not be allowed by the Commonwealth of Australia. And here they are. Here they are calling people with disabilities. Disabilities are such things as people have when they're in a position of power, or they're given a particular, a particular device, such as a hearing aid, that might be, might come under that definition. I'm not saying all of them do, but sometimes they do. There is a security issue. That's what disabilities are. So when going for a Senate, I don't have any disabilities. I'm going for a house. I don't have any disabilities. I'm an Australian citizen. I haven't been ever charged with a crime. I haven't done any jobs with the government that would make my person subjected to disabilities. And disabilities don't overlap here, and here, and don't allow, crime-based people who've done crime to sort of encroach on government too much, because they start doing things and things start getting corrupted more and more. And that's the idea. But when you've got small crimes being used as the conceal for big, massive crimes that psychiatrists are doing and getting away, and they're the authority, that's when you have something really, really scary happening in your country for a long time. 120 years of slavery and torture in the legislature, and we need to abolish it. So no more forced psychiatry, and as far as I'm concerned, abolishing psychiatry will be the victory for Australian people, having all those psychiatrists put in prison, having them charged with all their horrible, horrible crimes. These men and women who, these psychiatrists, these fellows of RANZIP who've been given power by our government for way too long to do these horrible forced human experimentation on the population. We don't want them monitoring and enforcing standards, because they're just utterly disgusting, vile, cruel, forced human experimentators. And that's all they are. Psychiatrists, that is all they are. Where I'm coming from is 14 years of slavery and torture under that regime. Where I'm coming from is understanding where they attack people in the community, as well as when they hold people in arbitrary detention. Where I'm coming from is the abolition of slavery in Australia, and that's just what we've got to do for Australians' lives and livelihoods. Not conceal it by calling it a disease. That is just backwards thinking. That's not law. That's not budgeting. That's complying with the enemy to Australian people, the criminal, horrible medico militia that has grown out of control.